Welcome and thank you for joining today's Agile Live webinar on Agile Leadership for the Enterprise. Version 1 is pleased to sponsor the Agile Live Thought Leadership webinar series, which is focused on helping Agile leaders further accelerate enterprise Agile adoption and helping your organizations scale Agile faster, easier, and smarter. Before we get started, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. For those of you who haven't used On24 before, I would like to point out a few areas on the audience console. All participants are muted throughout the presentation, so if you have questions, please send them through your Q&A panel. And at the end of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. In addition, many thanks to all of you who've submitted questions in advance. During the course of this webinar, most of these will be addressed, and we will try to cover any remaining questions at the end. If you have technical questions, please click on the question mark widget at the bottom of the screen or submit your question and an On24 representative will be happy to assist you. I would like to encourage everyone to share your aha moments with others during the event using the Twitter panel. If you would prefer, you can simply close the Twitter panel or any of the other panels so you can focus on the presentation. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send you an email in a few days with a link to an overview and recording of today's event. So on that note, I'm going to turn the presentation over to David Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times and the moderator for today's event.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank Version 1 for having me be a part of this presentation today, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm glad to see so many of you with us today. As we've been reporting in SD Times, Agile development processes have become the way to create software. But in many organizations, the Agile journey began in a pilot project with a team leader also serving as the Agile champion. But as these organizations look to scale Agile processes across different teams, different locations, and even into other non-development areas, they're finding voids in leadership. Here to talk about this today is Pete Behrens, Leadership and Organizational Agility Coach with Trail Ridge Consulting. He's been guiding enterprise Agile transformations for more than 12 years. Through his unique inside-out approach to Agile transformation, Pete guides organizational leaders in assessing, integrating, and transforming their organizations through Agile leadership maturity, cultural alignment, and organizational agility. He's guided dozens of organizations through their Agile journey and has been instrumental in some of the most successful Agile transformations, including Salesforce.com, GE Healthcare, and McKinsey & Company IT. In addition to guiding client agility, Pete is leading the formation and definition of enterprise Agile coaching through the formation and coaching certification of the Scrum Alliance Certified Scrum Coaching Program and the International Consortium of Agile Enterprise Coaching Definitions. Pete regularly speaks at Agile conferences, Scrum gatherings, client events, and other user groups. But enough about Pete. Let's bring him out here now to kick off the discussion. Pete?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I appreciate that introduction. Seems a bit overwhelming, but we'll go forward. I've got three things that I really want to share today. First one is kind of what we're seeing today in the world of enterprise agility. I'm going to focus on three companies that I think have proven sustained and growing agility. In fact, I think they're succeeding in the industry because of their agility. And finally, I think we're going to talk about Agile leadership. What's driving these companies? What are some principles in leadership that are leading them? So those are the 3 points. What we're seeing today essentially is a lot of change over the last decade. You know, not only in just technology over that time, but also just in the way we work. If we go all the way back into the early 1900s, we see Ford Motor Company and introducing essentially this assembly line process and in specializing the work in creating higher flow and volume of automobiles and high quality. Jump into the middle of the century here and essentially we see that waterfall, which is essentially taking that manufacturing approach into software. Here you're seeing a picture of IBM workstations or mainframes at this point, and saying, okay, we can apply this in new ways in a phase-based approach. And the later half of the century, we've seen a lot of growth, not only in manufacturing through lean, Toyota production system, things like that, but we've also seen tremendous growth in the way we work through things like rapid application development, Spyro, which is a very iterative approach to software development, creating tremendous feedback, and finally, probably where we are today with this, with Agile and a very iterative team-based approach to seeking feedback. Now, at the same time this has been going on, we're seeing another trend in the industry, and that is the trend of the corporation. If we go back to Ford Motor Company in the 1930s, the average lifespan of a company at that time was about 75 years. In 1970, that dropped to 40 years. Today, that number is 15 years and dropping, meaning we're seeing an increase in disruption of the workplace, increase in companies starting and failing. We're seeing an increase in speed, not only in the way companies are working, but we're seeing an increase in speed in the way the markets are being driven and new ideas are being tried. Now, CEOs are very aware of this. Essentially, IBM runs some surveys every other year. The last couple of years, they focused on a few things. Some of the key points that have been drawn out. Number one, CEOs are seeing this disruptive workplace, and they're seeing the fact that open and collaborative cultures are enabling them to handle this complexity, this disruption. And there's a desire to have more open and collaborative cultures. In fact, those companies that are doing it are performing better than the companies that aren't. A second result that came out of that, some of those surveys, is they've identified creativity and agility as two key leadership competencies that they're seeking to address this complexity and this disruption that's going on in the workplace. And it's interesting that creativity and agility were drawn out, and I thought about this for quite a while, and I realized creativity is essentially agility of the mind. It's the ability for you to adapt your thought process, and then agility is your ability to adapt your actions, right? So creativity and agility are really just two sides of the same coin and two different perspectives. Your ability to think differently, and then your ability to act as a body or as an organization through those thought processes. So it makes sense when we tie these two things together. Now the challenge on the other side, get that next slide. There's tremendous amounts of documentation or books out there today. Steve Denning, a well-known author in Forbes magazine, has written a number of things around this new management paradigm and is highlighting books throughout a number of different disciplines and areas that are focusing on this new creative, innovative, discovery-oriented approach to running organizations. So it's not just me, it's not just IBM, it's not just version 1 here, it's really there's a trend going on, and it's out there today, and it's happening, and it's up to us, I think, to do something about it. Now, getting to that downside, version 1 runs surveys each year. They've been doing this for about 7 years, and they've got thousands of respondents to the survey, global, worldwide responses. Two key points I'd like to draw out of this. One is 52% indicate that culture is impeding their ability to actually adapt or to become more agile. It's impeding their organizational agility. And the second one, that 41%, they're saying just a general resistance to change. It's hard to change. It's hard to be agile. It's hard to change to be agile. And these are two key indicators that are preventing companies from going further or adopting Agile further. Now, if we dive that a little bit deeper in that same survey, a couple of key points that come out that I'm highlighting here. First, this concept of failure to integrate people, right? I think if we look back to Ford and Ford's creation of a bunch of specialists working along a manufacturing line, Agile is often seen as a myth of we need generalists. Well, that's not true. Really what we need is to integrate specialists. We need to integrate that diversity to create effective solutions in a complex world. And so this concept of failing to integrate people and failing to teach a team-based culture is really critical towards organizational agility. So there's a number of patterns that I think we're seeing based on this challenge of culture and this challenge of having difficulty or resistance to change. One is what I call a thrashing agility. What this essentially means is companies are trying to be agile and struggling, meaning they have a success in one project but not another. They have a success in one department and then fail to scale it. They have a good program and they have a challenging program. And so you get this hit and miss of agility. It works in some places but not others. Now compare that with another pattern that I often see, which is, all right, we recognize this is hard, so let's get some help. And so we get some consulting, we get some training, we get some assistance in becoming more agile. But then we run into a wall. We hit a plateau, and then it doesn't stick. In fact, it fades over time. I've worked with a number of organizations where I've been on this roller coaster where, let's bring Pete back and let's help in some ways. Well, this pattern is something that I'm seeing across the organization, and I've been working with this for the last few years and understanding some of the drivers. One of the key drivers I think we're seeing is this concept of outside-in agility. What this means is, Scrum even says, okay, put in Scrum, identify your impediments. Kanban, put in a Kanban system, identify your bottlenecks. These processes, this process-first approach is intended to identify or raise the issues inside the organization, and that's great. The problem is a lot of these impediments, a lot of these issues are structural, meaning they're embedded into the organization and they're based on a value system that the company has that they've been built up over not only years but decades of the way companies succeed. And so when you bring Agile in these organizations, what happens is essentially they start hitting against this wall of culture and structure that's been there for so long. And essentially these rolling and thrashing agility are just the sense that people are, banging their head against this wall of change that's difficult. And they get tired and eventually stop or they move on to another company where it's easier. And this is a frustrating pattern. Now, there's a number of companies I want to highlight today that actually have, I think, broken through this barrier, that not only are sustaining but are actually thriving in their agility and growing their organization, winning in the industry. And what they've done is they've taken what I call an inside-out approach. Basically, they're using culture as a starting point. They're saying, okay, we have a value system. We want to value agility. How do we align these to build the structure to actually support an agile practice? And so when you take this approach, you can actually then build essentially an organizational agile architecture to support this concept of growing and sustaining agility. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on through a couple of companies today. So in summary of this first point here, I think we all recognize the pace of change is increasing. Disruption is becoming more prevalent. CEOs are obviously wanting some enterprise agility in some way. They're looking for that creativity and agility. And finally, it's hard. It's difficult. It's a challenge, and most companies are not doing it very well today. And my premise here is culture is a key. So what we're going to be doing is focusing the rest of the talk now on how we get there. Before we do that, though, I'd like to actually poll you. This is your chance to actually interact with the seminar, the webinar here. How has culture impacted your company's agility? Has it impacted positively, meaning your culture is enabling your agility? Is it negative, meaning it's impeding your agility? Or do you think it hasn't had any impact on your agility? Or if it's not applicable, you can respond to that fourth bucket. And you can click Submit. This is the time I'll invite David if there's another question you'd like to ask while we're gathering these answers. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I'm just curious in talking about this. Is this something that would apply to any organization? Do they already have a culture in place, or how would this apply in to certain organizations?
Sure. Yeah, it's often a myth that Agile is applied to software development. And I think this concept of agility, as we're talking about here, is this concept that organizations have to be able to adapt, or they're going to be, essentially eaten up by someone else, or they're not going to be effective and they're going to eventually die. Kind of a Darwinian thought process here. So I think agility as a construct, as a value system, applies throughout all industries. Whether that's a service organization, whether that's a manufacturing organization, whether that's software development, or even a church per se. You've got to be able to adapt not only how you do things, but you've got to adapt your organization itself to respond. And that's what we're going to be really focused on here. Is this applies, I think, broadly across any organization that needs to change based on their market conditions and based on their competition and whatnot. All right, so let's gather your results. Let's see what people have said here. I will go forward. So it sounds like the results here from our poll of people that are joining this conference are indicating even maybe a slightly higher percentage, 58%. Maybe that's why you're on the call. This is a challenge for you. So it sounds like this is an issue that is addressed, that is something that's important to you. So let's carry that forward. Just a few words about myself before I go on. I've been fortunate to kind of follow this trend myself through my work. I'd spent quite a bit of time with EDS, Electronic Data Systems, and did a lot of these large phase-based programs that took multi-years and never saw any value from them. I was fortunate to work in a concept called rapid application development where we did see some quick return on investment. I spent about 7 years with Rational Software in developing the RAS unified process, trying to do requirements better, trying to understand how we build solutions better. Ultimately, I think Rational was a bit too heavy from the standpoint of, and from an Agile perspective. I think they're changing continuously. And as David mentioned, the last 12 years really spending focused on Agile and helping companies understand how to adapt a little more quickly. And that's where I want to focus. Is the next section here is actually talk through 3 different companies and talk about how have they done this, how have they broken through this challenge. I'm going to focus on McKinsey & Company. This is a consulting firm focused on their IT organization. Focus on Salesforce.com, which has had lots of things written about them. And finally, GE, which is probably one of the largest organizations in the U.S. here. So let's start with McKinsey. McKinsey & Company is a global consultancy. They've got probably about 10,000 consultants worldwide. It's probably one of the most prestigious management consultancies in the world today. If I'm focusing right now on their IT organization, it's what we call a create culture. This is essentially a culture that is very supportive and invests in people. It's organic. It's fluid. You see a lot of investment in growing people, investment in learning, investment in growth. You see companies like Herman Miller, Celestial Seasonings, or 3M kind of fall into this create culture mentality. They focus on what's called transformational change. They're really looking at big change. How can we change ourselves? Now, a little bit about McKinsey's IT organization. Back in 2007, they had a lot of problems. Like many companies go through struggles, they had very long release cycles, over a year long in many of their applications, some 2-3 years long, that were not delivering the value they needed. Poor product quality, which I think a lot of us can attest to. And their development costs, the biggest issue was their development support costs were growing far too fast at an unsustainable pace. So overall, their stakeholders, their consultants, the IT leaders were not satisfied with what was going on inside the organization. Now, let me show you the big picture first here with regard to what happened. Right, when we look at the last 5-6 years here, we see a dramatic change, a dramatic shift, not only in the time to market and in reducing their ability to get functionality to their business, 75% reduction in time. At the same time, although a few years later, we're able to actually affect their defect rates in a similar form. At the same time, they've reduced all of their costs. So you might ask, how do you do this, right? How do you make this type of change inside an organization over 5 years? At McKinsey IT organization, because it's a create-based culture, we actually vision culture. We actually vision the organization. And what I'm showing you here is just kind of a snippet artifacts of some of the visioning workshops that we have and some scoring of some of those things. And you're seeing things in here like global integration or, good to great. If you look at McKinsey, this was kind of in the midst of some of their agility, right? They're starting to be good at Agile. They're starting to understand Agile. It's starting to impact their business. But they recognize that it's a journey and that they've really got to go from good to great to actually make an effective difference. At the same time, it's a very diverse organization. They're spread out, U.S., India, multiple places in India. How do you get this company to work together effectively? Because of their culture, a number of things that we focused on were regarded around integration of things, integration of their roles, integration of their teams, and integration of their departments and locations to actually create a much more effective workplace. Let me maybe highlight a little bit about what that means. So over the course of this 5-6 years, we saw their delivery cycle drop tremendously, 12 months down to a single month. This was incredibly hard, and it took a lot of change. The changes that you see there in green, essentially what we call the organizational agility line, started from a very simple concept. How do we get software working more effectively, more repeatedly, quicker? But what ensued from there was not just fixing their development process. It was changing their organization. They removed the quality assurance group as a role and said, we want to distribute responsibility of quality across the entire organization. That means it's everybody's responsibility. They broke down some silos between development and support that were there that basically said, we don't want this difference between how we support and how we write our applications. What we're going to do is actually do a web mash, a mash between architecture and support where we create teams that actually share. And so they broke down the departmental barriers and said, we're all on the same team. We're going to root cause analysis every issue that comes in here, and we're going to fix it. They changed a lot of their roles and titles, so they don't today staff teams as, okay, you're a business analyst, you're an engineer, a test engineer, you are a Java engineer. What they do is they get people with skill sets, and what they do is they build teams based on a wiki that basically says, hey, here's what people know and understand, and then they let the team self-organize on how to accomplish their goal. They don't assign the responsibilities. The team shares their responsibilities, and they're effective at this because of what they do is what's called half teams. They used to have teams that were about 9 or 10 in size. Those teams today are 4, maybe 5 people, and those teams are more productive than those teams of 9 or 10. Even if they're distributed, and that's where the global integration came in. So when you look at someone like McKinsey, what they've done is they've transformed their internal operations so effectively that their stakeholders are so impressed that they're saying, hey, our clients are struggling with this. Can you help them? So they've actually taken inside McKinsey what's called the SSE, their Solutions Center, and now they are actually working with their consultants to deliver Agile services to their clients who are struggling with this as well. So they've gone from a cost center now to a profit center in the course of about 5 years, going through some of this change. Now let me highlight a difference, a completely different company, and how they approached agility. Now, if we look at Salesforce, Salesforce.com is a global leader right now in CRM, Customer Relationship Management Services. They're about $2.5 billion in revenue. Their R&D organization is what we call a compete culture. This is a culture that you would see in like Silicon Valley high-tech firms, like a Microsoft. They're very competitive not only externally, but they're competitive internally. They're always wanting to be better. They're always, not only better, but be the best at something. And they're never satisfied with what they just did. They know they can do better. And this concept of competing is I want to get there first. I'm going to do it fast. And you see this a lot in like I said, in that Silicon Valley area. Now, Salesforce also had challenges back in about 6-7 years ago. They were actually growing probably too fast. They went from 20 people to about 250 people, and the complexity of the system broke down. What worked for 20 obviously did not work for 250. And not only that, there was this internal competition going on. People were grabbing people, leaders were grabbing people and trying to compete for how they were going to program them. And so you saw this concept. They couldn't deliver solutions. In fact, in 2006, it kind of came to a head. Their ability to release software essentially stopped. In fact, in 2006, they weren't able to release any software of major functionality because of this complexity. So what did they do? They essentially, in 1 year, they turned this thing around. The miraculous kind of transformation that happened inside R&D. And to talk a little bit about how they did that, I'm going to talk on the right side of this slide and then go to the left side. One of the keys we did here, talking about the right side, is unlike McKinsey, where we could redefine roles, we could redefine, remove some of the roles. At Salesforce, my role is tied to my entity, is tied to my competition. I want to be the best engineer. I want to be the best test person. I want to be the best documentation person. That's part of their culture. You could never remove those different roles at a Salesforce. Instead, what we did is we said, we got to use the culture. We got to leverage the culture. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to tweak a couple of things. We're going to just tweak a couple of roles. One was their engineering management role was critical in driving programs. we actually split the responsibility between the engineering managers and product owners and said, hey, product owners, you are now responsible for the what. Engineering managers, you are only focused on the how, meaning how do people do work, coaching people to be better at their work. But everything goes through the team now. There is no individual heroism. There's only team heroism. So what we did is we basically took their competition from individual to competition being a team, and teams are going to win. On the other side of that, on the left side, what we said was, for a compete culture, there's this not invented here mentality, right? They were not going to do Scrum. They were not going to, in fact, even, they didn't even like me being there as a consultant because I'm an outsider. What they wanted is they need their own. And so what they did is they developed and packaged ADM, Agile or Adaptive Development Methodology, which is essentially, if you look at it, it's a Scrum shell. But it's not because it's theirs. They own it. They built, in fact, on Force.com, they built their programs running on it. And they're going to be the best at it, not only best at Agile, the best at their methodology, and they're going to win doing it. And so this concept of going in fast, going all in, and being the best was what was driving essentially their success. Now, if you look at Salesforce over the past 6-7 years, they've transitioned that R&D agility into their IT organization, into their technical operations organization, into their marketing organization. They've spread their agility across the organization. Today, if you look at Salesforce, they are the number one CRM out there. They're bigger than Oracle, SAP, and Microsoft from a market share perspective. I think in 2012 they're about 14%. I think the estimates I heard this year are 16%. And their markets, their subscribers are growing tremendously. And this has been fueled. Obviously, they've got some good vision, some good leadership going on in there, but it's been fueled by their agility in the way they're executing their perfect release, seasonal releases that they're coming through. Now, one additional organization which I think may resonate with many of you is GE. I'm going to focus a little bit here on healthcare, but also the broader GE because GE is doing some pretty amazing things these days. GE is what we call a control culture. Now, in a control culture, really what we're looking at here is traditional mindsets, hierarchical top-down, right? It's a focus on efficiency where, you don't have the big change. You have incremental change, right? And rules and policies are really critical, right? Cultures in healthcare, banking, retail, manufacturing, government, markets where efficiency and repeatability are critical. And I imagine there's a number of people on this call that maybe fall into, companies in this category. Now, if you look at GE Healthcare specifically, GE Healthcare is a $17 billion enterprise, right? It's huge. It's global, many products and services. And across GE Healthcare, they have overwhelming process overhead, right? They're having trouble to deliver for kind of the opposite reasons of Salesforce and McKinsey. But they have long delivery cycles, as many do, and it's a manufacturing mindset. GE comes from a manufacturing background, and to look at software as manufacturing has a lot of inherent challenges to it. So let's look at just a little bit about GE as a broader entity, and I'm going to kind of focus around three of their major divisions. We got healthcare, research, and energy here. But if you look at where Agile started at GE, it was actually with a joint venture between GE and UPMC, which is a University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is another probably a control culture type of environment. What they did is they created what we call an Agile bubble. Now, in this case, they were allowed complete freedom. They didn't have to follow GE practices. They didn't have to follow UPMC practices. They could be their own company. They were able to create essentially an ecosystem that was completely agile with some incredible leadership and driving that. Now, what that's done is it provided an example that a key leader within healthcare recognized for about 400 people and across what they call specialty solutions was able to apply Agile in a bubble, essentially to say, hey, we can do things differently inside this larger GE culture. And that continued to spread throughout the organization, throughout all of healthcare over the past 5-6 years in how they're approaching Agile. And it's essentially showing through incremental change, right? It's not transformative change. It's not major fast change. It's very slow, meticulous, methodical, evolutionary change. But what this is doing is it's starting to impact different areas of the organization as they're growing. And what we're seeing today is we're seeing the fact that their research organization is starting to apply this and integrating some of their teams. The energy group took a very technical approach. And in fact, it's all gone up into, as a whole GE enterprise today, they're using something they call FastWorks as a lean startup principle. And I'll share that here in just a second. So what you're seeing, though, is you're seeing very control culture sensitive approaches. In healthcare, we didn't do transformative organizational change. We're not changing teams. We're not going really fast. What we're doing is we're doing things very incrementally, like what we call water scrum fall, right? We still need a critical definition phase. We still need a critical V&V, verification validation at the final phase. But we put Scrum in the middle, and then we start to spread it out. We start to improve that, right? We're using safe release trains. This is what's called the Scaled Agile Framework release trains. It's a way to do incremental change without upsetting the entire apple cart, so to speak. Now, if you look at the energy side over there, they took a very technical approach. This is another very positive control culture approach, right? Let's just focus on test automation. Let's focus on build cycles and release times. And let's just be fast in the way we execute. Let's not try to change teams or change organizational structures, right? These are control culture type sensitive approaches to building agility inside a very large organization. And we've seen some very high success. In healthcare, we've seen reduction of cycle times. We've seen increase in overall product quality. We've seen huge release adaptation, meaning what I start with in definition, what I end with in execution is totally different based on being able to adapt to cycles. On the energy side, we see some great advantages of their build time and how it's saving them hundreds of thousands of hours across all their engineers just based on how they're building their software. And then in research, it's still a bit new. We're still working on that area, but they're doing a lot with integrating their research teams with their business side. So what we see at someone like a GE Healthcare, a GE in general, is this concept of not massive organizational change, not fast we compete change, but a slower incremental change. But yet at the same time, GE is what we call a top 10 innovative company. Boston Consulting Group just nominated them again. And they're doing something called Lean Startup, which seems kind of odd. Okay, Lean Startup doesn't seem to like it should apply to a GE, but it does. It applies in many ways to all of their initiatives. They're taking from Jeff Milt on down. They're saying we need to act like a Lean Startup if we're going to compete in the future. And so all of this started, though, with building essentially what we call Agile Enterprise bubbles inside a larger company. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go into the next phase. So let me just review. 3 companies, 3 completely different cultures. McKinsey with its create culture, Salesforce with a compete culture, and GE with a control culture. All can succeed and thrive with Agile, right? But they all take a very unique, different approach to doing so. And what we're going to be talking about next is essentially the different cultures require different agility. They also require different leadership in driving that agility. And so we're going to be talking about, all right, how as leaders now should we be focused in driving agility depending on kind of where we would fall inside this matrix. So we've got another question for you guys. You can stop hearing me talk for just a second. What has your Agile experience been like, your Agile enterprise experience been like? Do you feel like you've been thrashing? Have you been trying agility, but it really hasn't stuck or grown? Do you feel like you're in a rolling agility? You've had some good successes, maybe got some outside help, you brought some people in, but it's really been plateaued, or maybe it's rolled that back down, or it's reverted. Or do you feel like you've gone in that thriving sense? You feel like, oh, your organization is actually growing. It is actually thriving, driving business success. Or NA, if you haven't really been part of one, or it's too early to tell, or you're not even sure how to measure whether you're doing well at Agile or not, you can maybe put NA. So I'll let David jump back in and maybe intercede with another question. We can wait for the answer here.
Okay, I appreciate that, Pete. So yes, in listening to what you were saying, looking at it, you're talking about 3 massive companies, GE and McKinsey and Salesforce, with offices all over the place. So adding getting to the problem, I guess, is finding leadership in each one of those particular areas and implementing Agile where there may be different cultures within one organization, depending upon the location and other cultural factors that would affect that. And how do you kind of bring all that together? Or is that what you're going to be talking about moving forward?
Yeah, so essentially all of these companies are multi-located or dislocated, however you want to name it. They all have divisions in different parts of the country and world. And again, based on the culture, we take different approaches to doing that. So just as an example, at GE, we're co-locating product teams in different parts of the world. And so rather than having a product get developed in 5 countries or 4 cities, they're trying to co-locate that product in an area. Now that takes investment, right? That takes investment. IBM recently talked about the fact that they used to hire people at cheap locations. Like if somebody left Switzerland, they used to hire them in India because they could get it for 1/5 the cost. But they realized that the overall cost of the programs was going up, and that they actually found benefit to hiring the person back in Switzerland, even though their direct costs were higher. They found the communication, collaboration, coordination costs of that program were cost effective to rehire that person directly in that city. McKinsey's focused directly around this concept of taking an Agile culture from one location and embedding it in the other. So they'll take somebody, have them spend a year or 2 in one location, move them to the other location so that they can actually create that culture in that second location. So they're being very intentional about how they're sharing culture, and especially when they take that across countries. Mm-hmm. So each culture is taking a very sensitive approach based on how they perceive it. But as you're talking about, we will get into that Agile leadership next.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so for small companies that aren't multinational, may have different teams located within the country, or even just have one location, is that same idea of just breaking up full projects by team instead of having multiple teams work on one project, is that scale downwards? In other words, so even if I'm a smaller company, is that a best practice to just have one project with one team?
Yeah, we're seeing Agile be implemented across every possible spectrum of distribution, and the more technology can assist in collaborating across locations, the more help that's going to be. But tools like version 1 are certainly helping distributed teams communicate, connect, collaborate through a lot of their features. But there's no replacement for face-to-face. About 87% of communication happens non-verbally. It's really hard when you're in those positions. Teams are just not going to be as effective. So yes, I believe it does apply to large and small companies directly. All right, let's look at your results here. Looks like we're roughly the same proportion, 48% saying, okay, we're in a rolling, 23% saying we're in a thrashing. So yeah, between those two, about 70% are indicating kind of a challenged agility here. 10% of you, great work, thriving. Well, let's talk a little bit about this leadership, and let's talk about what it's going to take to essentially maybe start to move in from a thrashing and rolling. So what we're going to do is focus essentially on this concept of leadership agility. What does this mean? I'm going to talk in really just 3 parts. The first part is basically saying, as we've been talking about, culture needs to inform agility, meaning we need to align our agility to culture. Okay. Now at the same time, if we look at number 2 there on the left-hand side, leadership needs to influence culture. So the only place we can actually change culture is through leadership. And culture is one of those things that we know doesn't change overnight, doesn't change in a year. In fact, all these companies I'm working with, for the past 6-7 years, culture has not changed. Yes, we're influencing it, we're tweaking it, but we're not changing its fundamental culture signature. And finally, how do we develop this leadership agility to actually do this more effectively? So those are the 3 key points I want to make here. Point 1, aligning agility to culture. I've been using a number of different cultural assessment tools. I don't have an Agile specific tool. What I've found is there are a number of cultural tools out there that are helpful and can relate to Agile. The one I find most effective today is what's called the Competing Values Framework. It's a very simple Agile tool that we've been talking about here that has 4 quadrants. If you think about it, what they're doing, if you look at the right-hand side of this, it says the cultures on the right are very externally focused, very forward-thinking. The cultures on the left are thinking about the present. How are we doing today? What's going on now? You look at the cultures on the top, it's a very people-oriented culture. It's focused on teams and people and growing what they're doing. And on the bottom, you're focused on systems and artifacts and products and things like that. So you're seeing different dimensions represented in these cultures. And what we'll see is the fact that the create culture in the top right and the control culture in the bottom left are opposite cultures. They're polar opposites. But that every culture is not one-dimensional. Okay, so if we were to actually model what these three cultures look like as, through this lens, McKinsey has the preference for create culture, but it does have a little bit of all, like you would take essentially a personality test. I might be introverted, but I'm able to be extroverted when I need to be. My preference is to be introverted. Well, the same thing happens with culture, right? Their preference is to be growth and innovation oriented. Their preference is not to be repeatability, metrics oriented like you would see at GE in the bottom left, right? Just as Salesforce has a preference for speed, a preference for that competition element. And so each of these cultures, while having a preference, are not unidimensional in that sense. And so what we do is we look at these cultures, and so aligning agility to culture, what I've just been talking about in the last section, is to say, okay, based on this culture, what are the things we can do inside of our structures to actually change? At McKinsey, we talked about that's a organizational change. We break down silos. We change roles. At Salesforce, that means team structure changes, just slight tweaks to what we're doing structurally. That make a big difference. And at GE, the structures are more around those technical infrastructures of building software or integrating their release trains, et cetera. And then the process gets informed based on those structures. And I think we've walked through those, so I'm not going to spend too much time repeating that. What I'd like to do then is focus on essentially that other side. Okay, now that we know we should align our agility to culture, can we actually influence culture? And I believe we can. And I believe we need to. Organizations, I believe, should be looking at this. And the only one that can affect this is leadership. Because if you look at culture as a set of norms and values of what we believe in, only leaders can start to influence that change. So here's GE Healthcare primarily as what we call a control culture. At GE, what we're doing essentially is we're focusing on two dimensions. We're focusing on how can we increase our speed of rapid release, and how do we increase our ability to innovate. And so what we're doing is we're subtly trying to tweak the culture signature towards compete and create a little bit more forward-thinking culture. This isn't going to change their control culture bias. You're not going to take a healthcare company and not make them, value repeatability, predictability, those types of things. What you can do, though, is you can balance that culture with a bit more agility with that respect of keeping their core. Now, if you look at McKinsey, you might think, oh, this is a perfect Agile culture. Well, where GE has some faults in not being fast enough or not being creative enough, McKinsey kind of has the other problem. McKinsey has trouble maybe being too repeatable. So one project has some wild success, but it's not necessarily because it's so innovative, such a free-forming culture, it's not always repeatable. So they've been focused in two dimensions. One is being faster, right, their speed, and that's the whole delivery cycle we focused on. And the other one is actually some repeatability and competency in their quality. And so what we're looking at is using their culture and how do we move and shift that culture to respect agility, but also respect their existing culture. And again, this takes leadership to focus on the key initiatives. And finally, let's look at Salesforce. Salesforce is a little bit unique, and I think, David, you'd mentioned, okay, what about subcultures? Well, Salesforce is, and like many of these companies, but I'm going to highlight Salesforce here. Salesforce is a multicultural organization. And in fact, this came up pretty heavily in a couple of different areas that we were doing some work with. Their IT organization, unlike the R&D organization, is just like McKinsey. It's very creative-based. It's very innovative-based. What was interesting, when we had projects that tried to merge IT and R&D, this is some of their, what they call their App Store or App Exchange programs, they really had trouble working together. Some of those projects were the most difficult. And once we started to expose cultural differences, we started to break down the barriers of understanding why are we having so many problems. And to highlight another thing that was going on is they were in the process of buying a company. And it was a fairly large acquisition for Salesforce. I think it was the R&D organization of the acquisition was about 100 people, which was significant for them. And they wanted to integrate this within 3 months. And so we did a cultural signature. We looked at this company, and it was a very, very control-based company. Even though it was small, it had a control signature. And so the recommendation at the time was we've got to really work on how we blend these together, how we start to work R&D and the acquisition to actually be more effective. So what we've been doing with R&D is R&D has been a little bit more focused on this concept of team, right? So we've been really focused on how do we create teaming, which is in the collaborate quadrant. But the acquisition, we're focused completely the other direction. We're focused on how do we get away from some of the control culture so we can actually merge these two entities together a little bit better. So in working with this organization, went from what we thought was going to be a 3-month process. We said, let's take more time. And I was talking with the leaders a year later, and they said, this acquisition is still a challenge for us. It's still causing us some issues that we're dealing with. So in any sense, it's informing, they're leveraging culture in moving that forward. And so what we see is we actually can do cultural discovery and awareness, and these are some examples of things that came out of some of those sessions where we're actually exploring culture, using it and trying to figure out who do we want to become, how are we going to go forward. Finally, how do we develop leadership agility? How do we influence this leadership capability driving this? And I just want to focus on one main point here, and that is leadership agility is something that is changeable. The myth is that most leaders have the same maturity, and they just need skills. The fact is all leaders are at very different levels of maturity. Most leaders operate at what we call a heroic level, where, yes, they're effective, they're competent, they're also very competitive, and they're moving up fast in the organization. But they tend to leverage people and be fairly narrow in their scope of operations. Leadership agility is this whole concept around how do we become what are called catalyst leaders, a post-heroic mindset, where you're less focused on the work product, you're less focused on the product itself, you're focused on the organization, you're focused on the people, you're focused on the development of those people. It's a much broader concept of leadership maturity. And what it's doing is it's essentially something that works well with complexity, because what you start to do is you start to share the ownership versus you being the expert or you being the one making it happen. You're getting the organization to grow effectively. And this is something we can measure. This is something we can actually work with in driving increased leadership maturity. The second thing we're doing in these organizations is essentially driving change through the organization using Agile. So what this is saying is leaders operate on the organization while team members operate on products, right? So the leaders use an organizational backlog. They create organizational change through the same Agile cycles that teams are building products. And so the construct around driving organizational change is critical, not only as an initiative, but to think about it from an Agile perspective. And then finally, this concept of working with change. Right? Agile is not something that we reach. We don't get there. It's not a destination. And leaders are constantly dealing with change, and change is what Agile is about. And so because change is constantly speeding up, Agile leadership is around this concept of modeling your own self-change, your ability to be influenced, your ability to change, leading the organization change, and then coaching others into how to do this, dealing with change. And so this concept of change management is critical with regards to sustaining agility. So that's the we'll just end it there, and we're going to be opening it up to more general Q&A, and I'm going to let David kind of interact with that. But just to summarize, think about leadership agility as taking a culture inside-out approach, using culture to define the structures before you get into, okay, how do we actually be Agile? So, David.
Yeah, excellent. Great presentation, Pete. Raised a lot of points, and obviously, just from looking at the questions that are already in the inbox, I think we're going to have a good time. Just before we take on the first one, I just want to remind people they can ask a question simply by going to the Q&A panel on the console, typing in the question, hitting submit. We'll answer as many here as time allows, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say version 1 will probably try to respond to most of these after the fact via email. But anyway, so let me kick this off. The first question here would be, my company does not do application development, so as soon as my leadership hears Agile, they tend to tune it out as if it doesn't apply to us. I disagree. I guess my question is, who's right?
Yeah, this person is right, and I think there's some education that they need to introduce to leadership to help understand agility as more of a market understanding. I mean, look at competition that's going globally, the ability to compete and the ability to adapt is happening across the globe. There's a number of studies. The IBM one that I'm referring to is not software development related. There's a number of books that you can go back and look at that Steve Denning list and identify. A lot of those books are not software application related. So this is a global problem, a global challenge, I would say, and it's a matter of, I think, getting the right materials in front of those leaders.
Very good. The next question is interesting, kind of along the same idea, but takes it a step backward. It's the person wants to know how you even determine what your organization's culture is.
Yeah, so that's a good one, and a lot of people know it. I mean, you all feel it, and I think you all can answer what you think it is. But to actually get a good survey, what we do, and in fact, I think a little bit later you'll get an email that says you could take a cultural survey. The Competing Values Framework is something that's publicly available. It was developed by some researchers at the University of Michigan. It's been around for about 20 years, so it's not new. It's not even Agile. Yet I use it because it's a really simple framework, and it applies to agility really, really well. It's well instrumented. It's validated. It's been used, thousands of organizations worldwide as just a cultural assessment guide. And what it does for you is it asks basically just 6 questions, and it talks about values. What do you believe in, and how do you work? And then talks what would you like to be. So you can actually look at current and future state, and then start to use that as the guide forward. So when I'm working with organizations, that's my starting point is, okay, who are we? Where do we want to go? And now what should we do from that?
Very interesting. A couple of questions deal on a similar topic here, so I'll kind of throw it out there, and this will actually answer several of the questions. But the first one is, how do you bring together business and IT cultures to ensure alignment? How do you know that the agility culture is good for the masses? Has it been proven?
Yeah. What you were seeing essentially like at Salesforce is we did exactly that. We looked at what was their sales and marketing culture, what was the acquisitions culture, what was the IT's culture, what was the business culture, what was the R&D culture. Because the exposure, the awareness is the first step, right? In any 12-step program, recognition of self is the first step. So the same thing exists with culture is just who are we, how do we behave. And the problem with that, with culture is it's hidden. It's kind of those norms and values that we don't talk about. They're just kind of done. It's what we do, not what we say. So a lot of companies will talk about, we have 2 approaches. One is how we document what we do, but then how we really make decisions. And so the culture is kind of that how we really do things around here. And that is oftentimes hard to expose, which is why surveys are a really good tool to do that. So, yeah, this is really effective if you're trying to bridge some understanding between business and IT or business and development, because there's often a trust gap that's formed because of failures in the past, and your quality hasn't delivered, and you haven't delivered on time. And so you build up this resistance to, Agile's not going to be any better, right? So the whole point of Agile is, as I mentioned earlier, integrating the diversity of the organization. A key bridge to build is between tech and business.
So I guess the next question is kind of how do you do that? The question is, our culture is geared toward 100% accuracy and perfection with software. How do we get the rest of the company to accept the iterative continuous improvement process of Agile?
Yeah, so probably what we're looking at there is a company that's probably similar to what we saw, and I'll push a slide back here, to the GE, right, where a control culture is really focused on things around consistency, repeatability, metrics, things like that. My recommendation there is when we're looking at shifting, we aren't going to take away that culture, but what we can do is we can complement it. All right, so if metrics are important, repeatability is important, let's start to use some of the Agile metrics that actually drive that, right? So my recommendation would be shift right before you shift up. What that means is, as a control culture, shift towards the compete versus you try to shift towards people. It tends to be that cultures that focus on systems would rather change systems than change people. Cultures that focus on people have a little bit easier time starting to change systems, but so it's a little easier to go down. It's harder to go up. So the other thought process here is use Agile processes that are very consistent with your current process. So something like Kanban might be more effective at putting in place in a control culture than something like Scrum. Scrum is a team-based culture, right? So it's a little bit more on the top quadrant. Kanban is a process-based Agile, right? We do things the way we're doing them now. We just try to do it faster with more flow. So Kanban might be an easier introduction to a control culture that wants that repeatability. It also has a lot of metrics to it. So that's a couple of recommendations there. Don't try to go up, try to go right, and maybe looking at the type of Agile you're putting in place to align better with that culture.
Excellent. So somebody else asks, our company is focusing heavily on innovation. Are there any suggestions for tying our Agile transformation in with a big push for creating a culture of innovation?
Yeah, so that's a danger point, I would say. It sounds like those two relate. Culture of innovation, great. Agile, great. Right? So let's tie the two together. The danger is, change is a one-time event, but transition is more what we call psychological. Transition is something that changes over time, and some people transition faster, others don't. So it begins to happen as you get this dichotomy between those that have changed and those that haven't, and that's where a lot of companies get lost in change management. So doing the change is one thing, but transitioning people's mindsets is another. The danger there for me is, well, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to be more innovative, or are we trying to be more agile? So I would say, if we're going to tie the two together, maybe say, let's be agile so we can be more innovative, or say, let's be more innovative so we can be agile. But what is your ultimate goal here, right? And agile oftentimes is seen as an end goal, where it's really not, right? Agile is a means. Agile is a means to get somewhere. So my recommendation would be identify a future goal that's business related, that's success related, of which Agile is the mechanism by which it allows us to get there. Salesforce as an example, right? Agile isn't their end goal. Agile is their engine. But as an example, they got out Chatter, which is a Facebook-like integration, in 1 year. Well, they reconstituted 26 teams to do that, right? In 1 year, they took 26 teams, turned on a dime, refocused the organization on a goal, and achieved it through Agile. Not because of Agile, but not trying to do both at the same time. So just be careful mixing the message.
Excellent advice. Okay, we have a few minutes left. I just want to remind people, if they have any further questions, submit them now. Type it in the Q&A panel in the interface, and we'll get to as many as time allows. Okay, moving forward, somebody writes, doing Agile in a bubble within a large corporation, but having to work with teams outside the bubble. Water Scrum fall can be challenging. You have any tips?
Yes, agreed. So yeah, creating these bubbles, creating an Agile bubble takes incredibly strong Agile leadership. Okay, what we had when we created the bubbles at GE Healthcare, both in the joint venture, we had incredible Agile leadership that knew how to create, and brought in the right expertise to create that Agile culture. That was very distinct. In fact, if you look at the Omnix, which is the joint venture company, it's a create culture. It's not a control culture. It's an opposite culture to GE. But then when we moved that into GE, we couldn't just take GE and make it a create culture. But what we could do is that leadership, which was incredibly strong on top of the specialty solutions, was strong enough to be able to essentially operate in two worlds. They could operate upstream in a control way and operate downstream in creating a space for the teams to be in a much more Agile-friendly bubble. So So what you're doing essentially is you're creating a safe space. Now, what they're getting at is, okay, now how do you start to work with other groups that are outside of that bubble? And that actually happened at McKinsey. McKinsey, we got the application development team to work in a very creative way, but then the security team was in a very control-oriented way. The database team was in a very control-oriented way. What we did in those cases, we actually just invited them into the bubble. So, sounds kind of silly, but for example, you invite the database people to come play on the team. All of a sudden, that database people aren't being told what to do, but they get to actually participate and feel what it's like in this world. Now they become advocates for that other bubble to basically say, hey, there's something that's working over here. Let's try that, right? So, yeah, you've got to have strong leadership at the top, and you've got to be able to reach across the border to draw people into that bubble to work in that environment. And that's the way we were able to kind of spread these bubbles apart at both GE and at McKinsey, for example. At Salesforce, it was all top-down. They all just said, hey, if it's good for one, it's good for all, so we're all doing it, so it was a little different.
I guess this will be the last question, as we're pretty much close to out of time. How do you deal with the reservations of employees who don't accept an Agile approach in the transition phase? Yeah,
so it gets back to that resistance of change. And one of the things we recognize, the brain is threatened by change. Every person is threatened by change. That uncertainty throws us for a loop. When we're threatened, we get into a defensive position. In fact, our heart rate goes up, our breathing goes up. We're preparing to, address and deal with the situation as if it's life-threatening, and especially when the change is bigger. So people have a natural resistance to that change, and part of Agile leadership is actually learning how to take those threats into rewards, actually helping people recognize, from to be silly about it, to go from lemons to lemonade, right? There's what we call reframing constructs around looking at things from different perspectives. So Agile leaders do a really good job at themselves understanding the power of change and understanding how to deal with change, but also then coaching others in the respect of understanding their situation, understanding that it is a challenge to everybody, and then helping coach them through that. And so part of developing leadership agility is helping those leaders deal with these people that are resistant to change, because change is hard on everybody. It's hard on every organization, and what Agile is about is constant change. One of the leaders of Omnix, one of his famous quotes is, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's the mindset of kind of that Agile leader. So,
very good. All right, it looks like we're just about running out of time. Pete, I want to give you about 10 or 15 seconds to sum up any final thoughts you might have, last words of wisdom you'd like to impart to our attendees.
Yeah, so essentially, if you're looking at agility, think about taking a step back, because most agility, I think, is coming at it the wrong direction. Most agility is coming at it from what we do, how we do it. If you take a step back and really think about what do we value, I think you can actually take a whole different perspective to say, all right, Agile's coming with a set of values, whether we like it or not. Do they conflict, or do they complement our values? And if so, which ones do we enjoy? Which ones should we stick with? So there are lots of approaches to agility. Don't see agility as just one-dimensional. See it as a range of options that applies to everybody, but culture can definitely form your success going forward.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Pete, I'd like to thank you for a fascinating presentation. This is a great topic that I know many organizations are dealing with today, and I think a lot of these points were spot on. So again, thank you, Pete Behrens from Trail Ridge Consulting. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Version 1, for having me be a part of this webinar today. I think it was great. And until next time, the Agile Live Webinar Series, this is Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, saying so long for now.